70 years ago, a dam in Australia drowned an entire wetland. 8,750 hectares of forest, wildlife, and Aboriginal sacred trees vanished beneath the water. In 2009, authorities took a risk. They breached the wall and drained Lake Mokowan, exposing land unseen for decades. Suddenly, nature began rewriting history. Red gums planted by thousands, sacred sites restored, birds and visitors flooding back. But how did a single act of removal reverse generations of loss, and what does it reveal about the secrets wetlands remember? In northeast Victoria, the land that would become Winton wetlands once pulsed with life. Before the dam, this was a mosaic of swamps, woodlands, and open water, shaped by the seasons and the hands of the Yorta Yorta people. In 1970, everything changed. A 7.5-kilometer rock wall cut across the floodplain, and as the reservoir filled, 8,750 hectares vanished beneath the surface. River red gums, some centuries old, died standing. Their roots drowned, their canopies collapsed. Beneath the water, the remains of ancient trees, scarred by generations for bark canoes and shields, were lost to view, and their stories were silenced for decades. The promise of Lake Mokowan was water security and recreation. But the cost became clear as years passed. The shallow design meant the lake lost up to 50,000 megaliters a year to evaporation, enough to fill dozens of Olympic pools every day. Algal blooms turned the water toxic through the 1990s, closing the lake to swimmers and making it useless for irrigation. The death of 150,000 to 200,000 river red gums left a graveyard of trunks jutting from the water, stark reminders of what was sacrificed. Biodiversity collapsed. Waterbirds abandoned the area. Fish populations dwindled. Wetland plants that are adapted to cycles of flood and drought could not survive permanent submersion. For the Yorta Yorta and other Aboriginal custodians, the loss ran deeper. Scar trees, ceremonial sites, and gathering places were erased under the reservoir. Cultural memory was severed along with ecological function. The land's ability to support both people and wildlife was stripped away. Farmers who once grazed cattle or grew crops on the rich floodplain watched their livelihoods disappear. What was meant as progress became a source of regret as the community faced the reality of a landscape transformed beyond recognition. This was a loss of place and a loss of knowledge. By the early 2000s, water quality had plummeted. The government spent hundreds of thousands each year just to keep the reservoir functioning, but the returns kept shrinking. The lake dried out completely during the 1982 drought, exposing mud and dead timber, only to refill and repeat the cycle. Each year underwater compounded the loss of habitat, of culture, of possibility. The scars on the landscape grew deeper, visible in every drowned tree and in every story left untold. The need for action became impossible to ignore. The land waited, holding the memory of what had been and what might still return if given the chance. In 2009, the machinery arrived at dawn. After years of debate, resistance, and political wrangling, the decision was final: the wall would be breached. The dam stretched for 7.5 kilometers, a rock and earth barrier that had held back the broken river for nearly 4 decades. Engineers and government officials stood at its base, preparing for a moment that would undo a generation's work. Cutting through the wall was both a technical and symbolic act. Excavators tore into the embankment, stone by stone, watched by a committee entrusted with the future of the land. The breach was deliberate, irreversible. As the gap widened, water began to rush out, first in a steady stream, then in a torrent. Within hours, the reservoir that had drowned the Winton wetlands for almost 40 years started to empty. The draining was rapid and dramatic. In less than 2 days, the lakebed that had been hidden for decades emerged, raw and exposed. Mudflats stretched to the horizon, marked by the skeletons of drowned trees and the remains of lost forests. The air hung heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. For those who had fought to keep the dam, it was a moment of loss. For others, it was a rare chance to witness a landscape reclaiming itself. The government's choice to breach the wall was not made lightly. Years of mounting evidence, evaporation losses, toxic algal blooms, and declining water quality had forced a reckoning. The cost of keeping the dam outweighed its promise. The committee that took charge brought together scientists, land managers, Aboriginal elders, and local residents. Their mandate was clear: restore what had been lost, and do it in a way that honored both nature and culture. As the last of the water drained away, the true scale of the opportunity became clear. Land that had been written off as dead was now a blank slate. The challenge was immense. Decades underwater had stripped the soil of nutrients, leaving behind a barren, compacted crust. Invasive weeds and pest animals would follow. But for the first time in a generation, the broken river could flow naturally across the floodplain. Wetland channels and billabongs began to refill, not with stagnant water, but with the pulse of a living river. The breach marked a turning point. The community watched as a mistake was undone before their eyes. The risks were real. No one could predict how the ecosystem would respond or how quickly recovery would come. But the act itself was a statement of intent. The old wall, once a monument to progress, now stood as a reminder of the courage it takes to admit when something no longer serves the land or its people. In the days that followed, attention turned to the work ahead: replanting, restoring, and remembering what the wetlands once were and what they could become again. The first green shoots broke through the mud where water had stood for nearly 40 years. The ground, once choked beneath a stagnant reservoir, became the staging ground for one of the largest tree planting efforts in Australian history. Over the next decade, a quiet army of volunteers, schoolchildren, retirees, farmers, and Yorta elders shouldered spades and seedlings. Their task was to return life to a landscape stripped bare by decades of submersion. River red gums, Eucalyptus camaldulensis, were chosen for their deep roots in this country's story. They are the natural architects of floodplain wetlands, able to withstand years of drought and sudden inundation. Their twisted trunks and wide canopies once lined the banks of the broken river, providing shade, shelter, and food for countless species. They are also woven into the cultural memory of the Yorta, who used their bark for canoes and their hollows for ceremony. The goal was ambitious: to plant 150,000 red gums across the exposed lakebed, matching the number killed when the dam was built. Each sapling was a promise. Volunteers logged thousands of hours, working in all seasons, braving heat, mud, and biting winds. Some days, entire families turned out, children racing ahead to dig holes, parents tamping down soil around fragile stems. Community groups adopted plots, returning year after year to check on their trees. Elders shared stories as they worked, explaining how red gums shaped the wetland cycles, drawing up floodwaters, dropping leaves that fed insects and fish, creating hollows for birds and mammals. The act of planting became a form of healing, a way to reconnect people with place. The transformation unfolded in layers. At first, the saplings stood in regimented lines, dwarfed by the skeletons of drowned giants. But red gums grow fast when given the right conditions. Within a few seasons, their leaves cast dappled shade over the cracked earth. Their roots began to break up the compacted crust, allowing water and air to reach deeper into the soil. Fallen leaves gathered in drifts, building new habitat for insects and microbes. As the trees grew, so did the sense of possibility. By the 15th year, the change was unmistakable. Where once there had been only mud and memory, a young forest stretched across the floodplain. The red gums formed corridors and islands, scaffolding for the return of wildlife. Each tree, planted by hand, helped stitch the wetlands fabric back together. The scale of the effort, 150,000 red gums and thousands of volunteer hours, became a living testament to what can be achieved when a community commits to restoration. The Forest of Red Gums was not just an ecological project, but a collective act of hope. On a cool autumn morning, Yorta elders gathered at the edge of the newly exposed floodplain. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and eucalyptus. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the scars on ancient red gums, once hidden beneath the lake, could be touched again. These were not just trees. Each bore the marks of ceremony, long, clean wounds where bark was cut for canoes, shields, or kulamons. Some scars were so old they traced back through generations, each one a living record of family, law, and belonging. Restoring these sacred trees was a matter of deep respect. Elders walked the land, mapping the survivors and teaching volunteers how to recognize the difference between a tool mark and a natural split. Where trees had been lost, new red gums were planted in traditional patterns, guided by stories passed down through the Yorta Yorta language. Ceremonial plantings took place at sunrise. Smoke drifted over the mudflats as songs were sung, and hands pressed soil around young roots. This is cultural healing woven into every act of restoration. It was not enough to bring back the forest. The land itself needed to remember who cared for it and why. As the roots of red gums took hold, the wetlands began to breathe again. The first sign of revival came not from the trees, but from the sky. Black swans returned, their necks curved elegantly as they glided across shallow water. Flocks of gray teal and Pacific black ducks circled above, searching for places to nest. White-faced herons stalked through reeds that had not grown here in decades. Glossy ibis flashed their green wings in the sun. Royal spoonbills swept their bills through muddy shallows, probing for yabbies and insects. By the fifth year, birdwatchers recorded 180 species in a single season. Magpie geese, absent for generations, landed in noisy flocks. Latham's snipe, a migratory visitor from Japan, found refuge in the marshes. Even the secretive Australasian bittern, one of Australia's rarest waterbirds, was heard booming at dawn. The return of these waterbirds signaled a deeper change. Frogs called from hidden pools at night, eastern banjo frogs, spotted marsh frogs, and the growling grass frog, whose deep croak had not been heard here since the reservoir flooded. Fish recolonized the creeks, following the pulse of floodwaters. Invertebrates flourished in the leaf litter beneath young red gums. The wetlands' food web, once broken, began to knit itself together. For the Yorta Yorta, each returning species was a sign that the land spirit was healing alongside its body. The restoration of sacred trees and the explosion of wildlife were inseparable. Culture and nature, memory and renewal, moving forward as one. The wetlands were no longer silent. Life had returned, drawn by the promise of a landscape remembering itself. This was healing made visible. Word spread quickly after the wetlands began to recover. Birdwatchers arrived first, drawn by the sudden return of rare species. Soon hikers, photographers, and families followed, eager to witness a landscape in the middle of transformation. The official visitor numbers tell the story, from just over 36,264 people a year before the dam was removed, to more than 65,287 in recent years. That is nearly double the number of people coming to walk the trails, spot waterbirds, and stand among young red gums where a dead lake once stretched. Local businesses felt the change. Cafes, motels, and shops in Benalla and Glenrowan started seeing new faces, weekenders from Melbourne, retirees on birding trips, and school groups arriving for science camps. The annual economic impact now reaches between $10 million and $15 million. For a rural region once defined by loss, first of land, then of water, then of jobs, the wetlands became a source of pride and opportunity. Community events grew around the new identity, with guided walks, art installations, and cultural tours led by Yorta Yorta elders. Restoration was not just about plants and animals, it was about building a future people wanted to visit and a home locals could celebrate again. The wetlands, once written off as a mistake, now pull people in. They are a living, breathing example of how nature's recovery can revive communities as well as ecosystems. A single decision redirected the future of Winton wetlands. The Victorian government committed $17 million to remove the dam and restore the landscape, an investment that ran counter to decades of conventional wisdom. Instead of pouring more money into patching a failing reservoir, leaders chose to dismantle the very structure that had defined the region for nearly 40 years. This was not just about environmental repair. It was a public admission that the old model had failed and that real progress sometimes means undoing what was done in the name of progress. The budget funded the breach of the 7.5-kilometer wall, the reopening of natural waterways, and the groundwork for ecological and cultural renewal. On paper, $17 million was a fraction of what the dam had cost to operate and maintain over its lifetime. In practice, it brought a radical experiment. Could a landscape submerged for decades recover in a single generation? The answer is written across the floodplain. In just 15 years, the wetlands have rebounded with a speed and complexity that few predicted. Hydrological cycles, once interrupted by concrete and rock, now pulse through the land again. Marshes refill and drain with the seasons, carrying nutrients and life. The ratio is striking. Nearly 40 years of damage, and yet with the right investment and the courage to let go, the system began to heal in less than half that time. Winton Wetlands stands as a living template, proof that the most effective restoration can begin by removing what never belonged. 15 years after the dam's removal, the Winton Wetlands stand as living proof that nature remembers how to heal, if we let it. Across the world, more than 1,200 dams have been removed in the past decade, unlocking restoration on a scale once thought impossible. The lesson is clear. Courage to undo mistakes is the blueprint for renewal. What barriers are we brave enough to remove next? Join the conversation below.